Yo, I'm Michael Montero for Boxing Monthly. You're watching a Neutral Corner for the week of July 30th. The Nooch! One of the many cool features that Boxing Monthly does in every magazine, every issue I should say, they do a British ratings right here, and then right next to it, the world ratings. Pretty cool feature, and you don't have to be a British fight fan to find this interesting. It's a good way too for people outside of the UK that follow boxing to keep up with some of the up and coming British prospects. Pretty cool. Anyway, we got a lot to talk about. Let's get into some news and notes. Some good news for those of you out there who subscribe to HBO mainly for the boxing, and you've been disappointed with the HBO boxing schedule this year, as most of us have. Their September 10th show is now a triple header, right? Of course, that's going to be headlined by Golovkin Brook over in London, and the co-feature is the Gonzalez-Cuadras fight here in Los Angeles. But the co-feature to that fight out here in LA was the rematch between Jesus Soto Karass and Yoshihiro Kamagai. That originally was not going to be part of the HBO broadcast though. Only the people out here in LA that went to that fight were gonna be able to see it. But Peter Nelson has responded to the public demand, and I was one of the guys that was kind of reaming them and emailing and tweeting everybody I could, telling them that they needed to add that fight to the HBO broadcast, and they have. So give Peter Nelson and the guys at HBO some credit for this one. This is now shaping up to be a really, really great triple header. And in terms of action, we have to see. The main event, you know, it might be a one-sided beatdown, that's what most people are predicting. But the co-feature, Gonzalez-Cuadras, that I think, the more I think about that fight, because Gonzalez is coming up in weight, Chocolatito, you know, is coming up to $115 in that one. I'm starting to think that might be the toughest test of his professional career, and I'm not alone in that thought. I know some people out there are picking Cuadras for the upset. I ain't gonna go that far, but I think it's gonna be a very, very close competitive fight. And then of course, Soto Karass and Kamagai doing a rematch of their Fight of the Year candidate earlier this year. If it wasn't for Salido Vargas, their first fight would have been the Fight of the Year. That's a can't miss action fight, right? So those two fights are going to be amazing. And then you got the Triple G Brook fight, which I think will be more competitive than people are assuming it will be, but it's probably going to be a one-sided beatdown. Either way, that's a really, really great triple header, across transcontinental triple header. That's looking really, really good. Another just quick scheduling thing, Joseph Parker, the heavyweight, going up against Alexander Dimitrenko. That is set for October 1st. And look, he won the mandatory for Anthony Joshua's IBF belt earlier this year. Undefeated prospect, staying busy. He just had a fight, just scored another knockout, and now he's going up against Dimitrenko. I really, really like the way that he's building himself up. And you can make the argument that his last few opponents, his opponents combined this year, if you're including Dimitrenko, are better than Anthony Joshua's. I think you could easily say that, right? So this fight with Dimitrenko is going to really help prepare him for Joshua, which that fight's going to happen next year. By the time that fight finally does happen, Parker is going to be as ready as he's ever going to be for that fight. So the one thing I'll say about Joseph Parker is at some point he's going to have to leave Australia and come over to the United States, or at least relocate to Europe and get better sparring and training in with better boxers and better gyms. The scene out in Australia, it's a growing scene. There's some good fighters out there, but not at heavyweight, right? So he's been fighting in these controlled situations at home. He's been working on some things. There's some things I really, really like about Joseph Parker, but if he wants to get better and get to the level that guys like Anthony Joshua are at, he's going to have to leave at some point. But going up against Alexander Dimitrenko, that fight's going to tell us a lot. If he doesn't perform well in that fight, expect him to pull the move Alexander Povetkin pulled years ago when he was the mandatory for one of Vladimir Klitschko's titles. And his trainer at the time, Teddy Atlas, felt he just wasn't quite ready. And they pulled back from the mandatory position. They basically gave up their mandatory position. Don't be surprised if Joseph Parker really struggles with Dimitrenko or barely gets by him if he doesn't pull back from that mandatory position. If Dimitrenko pulls the upset, he becomes the mandatory for Joshua, and he would present the best opponent of Anthony Joshua's career. So either way, we get something good out of that fight. Good stuff there. WBC heavyweight situation with Wilder Povetkin. Mauricio Sulaiman talked about that this week. They're supposed to have an announcement on that coming up in the next couple weeks. They're meeting and talking about it with both sides, representatives from both sides. I've talked about this in several videos, the deal with Povetkin, and I'm not going to go into all the minutia there. The biggest hang up here, okay, Povetkin's been cleared under water rules, under all the drug testing stuff. He's clean now. He's been deemed clean. The fight can move forward. But now with Wilder, he's got a torn, I think it's, right hand, torn right bicep and broken right hand. He has some broken bones. So I would assume he's going to be out for the rest of the year. I would think, as long as they milked it, as far as finally signing the dotted line to fight Povetkin, you can expect that again. So we should get an announcement, I would think by the end of August or so, about, when that fight has to happen, or, as far as the time frame. Is it going to be the next fight for both guys? Will they get a tune-up fight? Et cetera, et cetera. From the WBC, we'll get that information. But this fight ain't happening this year, obviously. It ain't happening until next year. So those of us that have been waiting for that Wilder Povetkin fight, because I do think it's a fascinating fight, we're going to have to wait until next year. I still think it happens. I'm starting to wonder if it's going to be moved to America, though. That's what I'm starting to think about this, considering all the drug testing stuff going on. And further complicating it, look, the International Olympic Committee was considering banning all Russian athletes from the 2016 Olympic Games in Rio. They've since come back from that. They are going to go on what they call a case-by-case basis and review all of them. Track and field, though, they're cutting every Russian athlete out of track and field, banning them. And I think they're going to do it with weightlifting. Russia's bringing 11 boxers. And the AIBA, that's the authority that controls amateur boxing around the world, they basically said, look, we're going to follow what the IOC does and what WADA wants as far as drug testing. We're not making any ruling here. We're following what they say. So the International Olympic Committee hasn't said anything about banning all boxers, but you can bet it's going to be on a case-by-case basis. Like I said, Russia's bringing 11 boxers that qualified for the Rio Games, and several of them fought in the last Olympic Games and are returning. So you'd have to think that the drug testing is going to be very, very stringent for these Russian boxers, because like weightlifting and sports like that, I mean, doping in boxing can really, really affect people's health, right? More so than, let's say, swimming or something like that. This is a combat sport. So you'd have to think that they're going to take it very, very seriously. Also, real quick, before I get into the review of last week's action, I just, there was a big fight last weekend, we'll talk about that in a second, that may have affected pound-for-pound lists. And in fact, the boys at Boxing Monthly should be posting a piece about where we rank Terence Crawford on our pound-for-pound list. It should be up on the site. If it isn't already, go there and check it out. Just check over the next couple days. It'll be posted. So this was a pound-for-pound type of matchup, Crawford-Postol, right? And it just had me thinking about other potential pound-for-pound matchups coming up. And I just kind of wanted to go off a list because as much as we're bitching about the schedule this year, there are some fights that have some definite weight on a sport and some possible pound-for-pound ramifications, right? This weekend, coming up, you've got Santa Cruz Frampton. Now, look, if Frampton moves up in weight and pulls a massive upset and defeats Santa Cruz, he might be in pound-for-pound talks. If Santa Cruz completely destroys Frampton and gets him out of there in a few rounds, people might start talking about him in a pound-for-pound sense, right? September 4th, the Japanese fighter, Inoue, is going up against a Thai fighter, Kotietgam. Gaim, Kotiet Gaim, I think. That, Inoue is already on a lot of pound-for-pound lists. So that's a fight that has some definite weight to it. Of course, I already talked about the September 10th card. You got Triple G Brook. If somehow Brook pulled the upset there, he's on the pound-for-pound list. If Triple G doesn't look good and that fight goes the distance, Triple G might fall down or maybe off some pound-for-pound list. And of course, the co-feature, Chocolatito Quadras, that has huge pound-for-pound implications. Later on, the week after that, Shinsuke Yamanaka, a Japanese fighter who's kind of on the bubble of pound-for-pound list. He's has a rematch with Anselmo Moreno. I think their first fight ended in a close decision, maybe a split decision or something like that for Yamanaka. They're doing a rematch. That has implications. The day after that, you have Canelo Liam Smith. The more I'm thinking about that fight, I'm starting to think, look, Liam Smith isn't a slouch. A lot of you guys out there have said that he has no chance or anything, but call me crazy. Canelo's been weighing in at 155. Now he's got to shut off 1 extra pound. At some point, that extra pound, he's a growing guy, and you start, getting into your mid-late 20s, 1 pound like that can do something to you. So somehow, if Liam Smith pulled the upset, that has huge implications on the pound-for-pound list, and of course, the next year or so of boxing, as far as super fights coming down the line. And then in November, November 5th, Pacquiao's coming back, probably going to fight Jesse Vargas. So that has some definite weight to it. And then, of course, the biggest fight of the year, Kovalev-Ward, that's supposed to happen in late November. And by all accounts, HBO has Andre Ward by the balls. It should happen, unless there's some kind of injury when Ward fights Alexander Brad next month. So there are some important fights. It might not be the matchups we want, but these fights definitely have a lot of possibilities of affecting people's pound-for-pound lists and could shake things up in the landscape of boxing. All right, so let's review last week's action. We had some action on Thursday. Let's start overseas where Joseph Parker scored a 4th-round TKO. I talked about that, the fact that he's now lined up to fight Alexander Dimitrenko. Parker improves to 20-0 with 17 knockouts. Very rough around the edges, but has shown a real fighter spirit. He's taken some punches. He seems to be a guy that's ironing things out, working things out. It's going to be really interesting to see how he looks against a big, experienced, I wouldn't necessarily call him skilled, but a schooled fighter in Alexander Dimitrenko in a few months. Also Thursday, here in the USA, it was PBC on ESPN, middleweights. Undefeated middleweight prospects. Sergiy Derevyanchenko scores a 2nd-round KO against a completely shot-to-shit 42-year-old Sam Solomon. The boys at HBO, Joe Tessitore, when he was calling this fight, he kind of went a little nuts. It was a pretty one-punch knockout. I think it came off a hook, a counter hook. Solomon was trapped in the corner. Derevyanchenko really stayed on balance and landed a nice shot. It wasn't a full power. He didn't really turn over on it, but it was a perfectly placed punch, and it got Solomon right on the whiskers, and it was enough at this stage of his career to put him on Queer Street. He got up. It was in no condition to continue. Look, for Derevyanchenko, he's now 9-0 with 7 knockouts, and yes, he's a prospect. And when you think of 9 fights, you think, he's still a developing prospect. He's really not. He's right on the cusp of contending. And I want to say this was an eliminator fight. I believe it was an eliminator fight for one of the titles. Derevyanchenko, look, is an amateur, was 390-20, right? And then he fought in the World Series of Boxing, which was kind of this semi-pro, semi-amateur league that's still going in some places. He was 23-1 in the World Series of Boxing. So this guy has so much experience. He doesn't do any one thing particularly great, but he does everything very good. And I'd put him up there right now with most of the top 10. And the only thing that's going to hurt him maybe once he steps up, it is going that first fight where he's got to go 12 hard rounds. How is it going to look? Having so many amateur fights. And then the World Series of Boxing, those fights aren't many rounds. So he doesn't have a lot of experience going late into fights with high-level opposition. So they still got to bring him up slowly. He needs to get some rounds in before he's ready to challenge some of the elite guys in the middleweight division. But right now, you can make the argument that he's knocking on the top 10 in the division. He might be there right now. He might be right at the bottom of the top 10 in the middleweight division. Evgen Kitrov scores a 9th round TKO over Paul Mendy. He's now 14-0 with 12 knockouts. Both of these guys have fought on cards together a few times now. I think they've been on Showbox and stuff like that. And there's things, again, they don't do anything particularly great, but they have vast experience, particularly Derevyanchenko, who's probably a little further along than Kitrov. But both of these guys, people you want to keep an eye on, and they're both middleweights. What I find interesting is with the Eastern European fighters who have been really coming over in boxing now for the last decade plus, we're used to seeing big guys coming from Eastern Europe, right? It started with the heavyweights. It really started in the 90s, the late 90s, with some of the contenders. And even guys like Oleg Maskaev, who actually ended up winning a title, but these other guys that started coming over. But now you're seeing middleweights. You look at a guy like Lomachenko, who's really a featherweight, even though he's moved up in weight. You're seeing guys now in these lower divisions, in these mid divisions and these lower weight divisions come over from Eastern Europe. There really is a takeover happening in boxing with these guys. It's reminiscent. We've seen so many waves of different cultures dominate, or not start to dominate and take over in boxing over the centuries, right? Here in the United States, because this is kind of where the biggest fights and the real big markets in boxing have been, historically anyway. But, of course, there was the Latin invasion that started several decades ago. And, of course, places like Mexico and even Puerto Rico still, to a degree, are powerhouses in boxing. But the Eastern Europeans, man, they're coming over, and they couldn't compete in those smaller weight classes against the Mexican fighters and stuff like that. Now they can, and now in many cases, they're dominating. So it really is this invasion of these Eastern European guys. And you're going to see more of these lightweights and featherweights coming too. But man, middleweight, once these guys like Derevyanchenko and Kitrov move up, and you see there's more of these Eastern Europeans coming in the middleweight division, it's going to be exciting, man. Especially when some of these guys at 154, these Al Heyman guys like the Charlos and even Andre, guys like that, they move up to middleweight. It's going to get exciting over the next few years. But a lot of action here on Saturday. Before I get to the big card in Vegas, Fabian Maidana, Marcos Maidana's younger brother, he fought in San Antonio. He scored a 6-round TKO. He improves to 10-0 with 7 knockouts. I thought that was noteworthy. But obviously the big card was here in Las Vegas, right? Let's talk about the televised portion of the pay-per-view. Alexander Gottsik improves to 11-0 with 11 knockouts. He was dropped in the first round against Tommy Karpinski. I think it was a right hand. But he's a prospect. This happens. You're going to face adversity at some point, right? So I don't think people should make a really big deal of this, because Gottsik, I thought, responded very well. To be an undefeated prospect, fighting on a fairly big stage, which just was a pay-per-view, is in Vegas, right? On an important card, and to get dropped in the first round, a lot of prospects in that situation would panic. He didn't. He settled himself, he got back in control, and he slowly, methodically just put an ass whooping on Karpinski and scored the 6th round KO. So you got to have moments like that when you move up as a prospect. I don't look at this as a bad thing that he got dropped. I look at it as a good thing because of the way he responded. So I think that was a good learning lesson, and he can go back and watch that film and see what he did wrong. He can also feel confident that he was able to get up and come back and not only win that fight, but dominate. It's not like it was a difficult fight for him. Jose Benavidez scores a unanimous decision over Francisco Santana. He improves to 25-0 with 16 knockouts. This was a horrible score. Look, okay, let me go over the scores. 96-94 was one of the scores, which I think was a good score. Then the other two scores, 98-92 and 100-90. So Adelaide Byrd turned in the 100-90 score. She's had some horrible, horrible scores recently. Several that we can point to. And Glenn Feldman turned in the 98-92 score. You know, Glenn is getting old. He's getting up there in age. He hasn't turned in the crappy scores that Adelaide Byrd has, but he's turned in some questionable scores too. The 96-94 score I thought was a good score. I know several people out there that thought this could have been a draw. Even some people that thought Santana won. It was a close competitive fight. I thought that having Benavidez win by a round or two is okay. I could deal with it. Having it any more than 96-94, either way, for Benavidez or Santana, is a crazy score. Not good. Not good at all. But for Benavidez, he's had a couple of these where he's gotten questionable scores gone in his favor. And he improves now to 25-0, like I said. For Santana, he's got several losses. But the thing is, he's an exciting fighter. He makes for good fights. I think the fans want to see him again. And I think it's very, very possible we'll see him as, you know, the opponent, quote unquote, on one of these cards coming up in the near future. The star performance of this card was Oscar Valdez scoring a second round KO over Matías Rueda, and he wins a vacant featherweight title. It was the title that Vasyl Lomachenko vacated when he moved up in weight earlier this year. So now Valdez is 20-0 with 18 knockouts. He's supposed to fight again in late November in Tucson, Arizona, which is his adopted hometown. That's where his family relocated to when they came to America. So, look, he was going up against the complete punching bag, pretty much. Rueda, look, I talked about it last week. Some of these guys from Argentina, they come up here and they surprise you. A lot of times they come up here and they have horrible, bloated records built upon horrible opposition. They have shiny, nice, pretty-looking records against horrible opposition, and you kind of get what we got in this fight. But Valdez did what you're supposed to do in that situation. Came out guns blazing. I think he felt what he had in front of him, and he did what you're supposed to do. It was a star-making kind of performance in a way. Not many people saw it. More about that in a second. But let's be real here. He has a title. He fights in a stacked division, one of the most talent-deep divisions in boxing. He's a prospect with a title. Not unlike Anthony Joshua and a few other titleists right now in boxing. So you guys got to remember there's a major difference between a champion and a titleist. And not all titles are created equal. This was a vacant title. The real owner of this title was Vasyl Lomachenko. Do you think Oscar Valdez would even be competitive with Lomachenko? Maybe for a couple rounds, but Lomachenko would absolutely school the guy. It would be pretty much a shutout. It'd go all 12, but it'd be a shutout, right? So he's a prospect with a title, okay? But obviously, we want to see more of this guy. And they need to develop him against guys that could give him a challenge. He had a fight on the Bradley Vargas undercard, I think against Ruben Tamayo last year. And he struggled in that fight. It was kind of, I think he was put down early. It was reminiscent of what I talked about just a second ago with Alexander Gotzik. He was put down, he had to come back, and he had to really, really make his bones in that fight. And I'm telling you, he has improved by leaps and bounds since that fight. So that just goes to show you how facing adversity like that as a prospect can do wonders for a fighter if they can rebound from it and show that they have that toughness, that they can go to another level. It's a mental thing. And look, for Valdez, it's a year later. Now he's got a title, right? Let's talk about the main event. So Terence Crawford wins a unanimous decision over Viktor Postol. Scores 117 to 108, 118 to 107 twice, and those were very accurate scores. Crawford landed 141 of 388 total punches for 36% accuracy. Postol lands 83 out of 244 for 34% accuracy. Postol averaged, coming into this fight, he averaged landing 20 punches per round. 20 for 71 was his average offensive output per round coming into this fight. And in this fight, he averaged 7 of 20 per round. 7 landed shots out of 20 total thrown, right, per round. So you see how his output was basically cut into 1/3 by Terence Crawford. And he did that with movement. A lot of people would say running. And there's some criticism about what Crawford did in this fight. Look, it was even for the first 4 rounds. This was a 2-2 fight after 4 rounds. And then in the 5th round, Crawford caught him, dropped him twice, and then the fight was completely changed. From that point forward, Postol was gun shy, and Crawford pretty much coasted. But you got the sense that had he stepped it up a little bit and stepped on the gas and pushed it, he could have got Postol out of there. You got that sense because he had buzzed him several times. He was just quicker to the punch. As I said last week, man, Postol, he does a few things very, very well, but Crawford does several things very, very well. And that's the difference. He just has more dimensions. He switched to southpaws. He's done several times on guys. And after the knockdowns, this pretty much was a dull, boring fight. And look, I wrote predictions for this fight for Boxing Monthly and for UCN Live. And my feeling was that this was going to be an even fight 6 to 8 rounds in. You know, after 8 rounds, this was going to be an even fight. And at that point, Crawford would take over. He took over a lot earlier in this fight than I thought. And I think the knockdowns had a big part to do with that. But, you know, it was, I thought it'd be even for 2/3. It was even for 1/3. So Crawford showed that he really does have that extra level. He's special. Postol is not a great fighter, but he's a damn good fighter. And at 140 pounds, he'd give just about anybody fits. Crawford might have showed the blueprint of how you beat him. You know, you just basically use movement and boxing and you give him angles. Something that guys like, you know, Matisse, at least at that stage of his career, you know, he wasn't able to do when they fought last year, right? I did think that Postol's ring rust would play a factor. It kind of did, but then again, not really. Because, again, this was an even fight 4 rounds in. And usually that's when the ring rust would show. But later on in the fight, it just looked like Postol didn't know what to do. He looked confused and gun shy. Okay, now, the criticism is a lot of fans are mad at Crawford for kind of pulling a Floyd Mayweather. And not only for that, but taunting Postol at the end of the fight, sticking his tongue out, running in the 12th round. You can make the argument that Postol won the 12th round because Crawford really didn't do much but run around and taunt him and stick his tongue out. And it's one thing to taunt a guy in a very close action fight where you had to come back from behind or something, or you scored impressive stoppage. But in a fight like this, where it was kind of times turned into a glorified sparring session toward the end, it just kind of rubbed people the wrong way. That combined with the fact that Terence Crawford has been very, very confrontational with the media, even his hometown media in Omaha. And he's had issues with people reporting some of the issues in his personal life. Even though I think that the reporting has been very, very fair, and for the most part, the media has been very, very good to Terence Crawford. He's not from a big market. He's not a very dynamic guy, not a big, big personality. But the way the brass at HBO has talked about him and promoted him, they made a show leading up to this fight with Postol, a 30-minute show that was all about Crawford, not at all about Postol. It was just promoting him and telling a little bit about his story. The boxing media, I think 2014, wrote Crawford as the fighter of the year. I know he was my fighter of the year. He was my choice. So everyone's been pretty good to him. And some of the ways he's been handling things with the media, it just kind of shows that I don't know if his head's in the right place. I don't know if he gets it. Certain fighters get it and certain fighters don't. There is elements in this promotion and up during fight week, and then of course the fight itself, and even in the post-fight interview where he said some things that just kind of didn't make sense, where he took some pages out of Andre Ward's playbook and he took some pages out of Floyd Mayweather's playbook. Now, both of those guys have done well for themselves financially and taken very little risk and very high reward, especially Floyd, obviously, but they're not very beloved by fans. Floyd has his little cult of fans, but for the most part, you know, yeah, they're not very... Some of that Floyd Mayweather cult has transferred over to Andre Ward, but I don't know. Some of those guys may trickle over to Terence Crawford, but not if he stays with Bob Arum. If he ends up leaving Bob Arum when their contract is over and he signs with Heyman or Rock Nation or something, then I think that Floyd Mayweather cult will follow him. But as long as he is signed to... I won't get into the demographics thing. As long as he's signed with Bob Arum, they're not going to fall in love with Terence Crawford. So, look, I think that somebody needs to sit Terence down and talk to him about handling the media better and promoting himself better. I don't think this pay-per-view card cracked 80,000 buys. I don't think it cracked 80,000 buys. Seriously. I know a few people. One of my buddies, Jeff Joyner, had his bachelor party and went up to Vegas to see that fight as part of his bachelor party weekend. So him and a bunch of friends went up there. I know a few guys that went up to Vegas to see the fight. Other than that, I really don't know many people who ordered the fight. You know, I don't know any of my close like boxing buddies and family members who watch boxing that bought the fight. So it lost a lot of money. And look, if Terence Crawford really didn't make the splash he needed to make the demand for a Manny Pacquiao fight, at this point, if you're Bob Arum and you're the guys at Top Rank, would you match Manny Pacquiao with Terence Crawford, who probably isn't going to bring a whole lot as far as pay-per-view buys with you? Or do you match him against Jesse Vargas, who I can hear everyone groaning right now, won't be the most exciting fight, but then again, maybe he would be. And he brings a Mexican fan base with him, right? So you can make the argument that a Pacquiao-Vargas pay-per-view does more buys than a Pacquiao-Crawford pay-per-view in terms of demographics and who's going to tune in and buy that fight. Also depending on the undercard and, you know, everything else. I just think that's the fight we're going to get. For Crawford, at 140 pounds, I don't know who's out there for him to fight at this point. Throughout the promotion, he weighed more than Postol. During the 30-day weigh-in, the 7-day weigh-in, he was the heavier guy, right? Postol can stay at 140 for the foreseeable future and be fine. But you get the sense that Crawford's going to have to move up anyway. He's going to have to go up to 147 and start calling out some of the Heyman guys, like a Sean Porter, if you will, or Thurman, Garcia, those kind of guys. So it'll be interesting to see where he goes from here, if he starts to kind of figure it out. But he's got to change that relationship with the media, man, because it's the media in this business is basically the extension of your promoter. Boxing promoters are concerned about putting on an event and working out the logistics of that event and promoting that event. A lot of times their deal with the network and everything else helps promote it, more so than the promoter themselves. But the fighters are promoted by the media. Do you see promoters getting their fighters on The Late Show and shit on TV? No. Do you see promoters getting their fighters out there on social media and Twitter? No. How many of you, learn about fighters from Top Rank's Twitter page? You don't. You guys learn about fighters and the ins and outs and the backstories from us. So the fighters need to do a better job of being more open with the media. Okay, so we got a couple interesting fights this weekend. So Friday, Adonis Stevenson going up against Thomas Williams Jr. This is in Quebec, PBC card. And on the co-feature, Stevenson's mandatory. Eleider Alvarez is fighting at 180-pound catchweight, which I don't get. I guess, look, he's been a little heavy for fights before, so I think he has trouble making 75. But Alvarez won the WBC silver title back in October of 2014, this Colombian fighter. He's fought on several Adonis Stevenson cards, either in the co-feature or on the undercard. The silver title for the WBC is essentially the mandatory. So he's been the mandatory for Stevenson for going on 2 years now. Yvonne Mitchell, the promoter that Heyman's working through and everything with this card, says that should Stevenson and Alvarez win their fights, that match will happen next. It should happen by the end of the year. That's what he said this week. We'll see. It's been, like I said, almost 2 years. For Stevenson, this will be his first fight of the year, right? Last year, he fought Saki Obika, a shot, faded version of Saki Obika, and Carpensey. That's who he fought last year. This guy has completely destroyed his career. I find it interesting that there are still a few people out there on Twitter and stuff that defend Adonis Stevenson, especially with the Sergey Kovalev situation, where they were both fighting on HBO, had an agreement to fight each other, were fighting on cards together, and at the last second, Stevenson jumped ship, ran over to Showtime, and has pretty much fought, at least in the last year and a half, nobody. Thomas Williams Jr. got this fight because he beat Edwin Rodriguez back in April in a PBC card here in Los Angeles. I think that one was on NBC, ABC, one of those afternoon cards, right? But that fight, man, horrible fundamentals. I remember that. I remember Edwin Rodriguez just looked like he didn't give a shit. His punches were so wide and looping. His footwork was horrible. His balance was horrible. He just looked terrible in that fight. And Thomas Williams Jr. really didn't look much better because he just never had good technique. The one thing Thomas Williams Jr. does have is some power, a little bit of snap. So maybe if he connects on Stevenson, we could see an interesting fight here, but you'd have to think that both Stevenson and Alvarez win dominant fights here. Neither of these fights should be happening. Those two should be fighting each other, but this is an ongoing problem, particularly with their management. So Saturday on HBO Latino, there's a card here from Indio, California, which is an hour or so away from Los Angeles. Antonio Orozo is fighting Abner Lopez. Orozco is 24-0 with 16 knockouts. He lives in San Diego now. That's where he fights out of. Undefeated welterweight prospect. He had a big win last October against Humberto Soto here in LA. I was ringside for that fight, and I remember thinking at that point, this was him graduating from prospect to contender. He's ready to contend. Even though Soto is old and past his best, he's still a good quality fighter. But something must have happened in that fight that Orozco's people saw. I don't know what it was, because since that point, his career's kind of plateaued. And maybe this fight is going to get him back on track, but it's like you figure by now he'd be contending for a title. At that time, last fall when he beat Soto, I just thought, man, within a year, this guy's going to be challenging for a title. right? It just hasn't happened, man. So I don't know what's going on with him. He's kind of leveled off. But in the co-feature, featherweight prospect Joseph Diaz going up against a Mexican fighter, Viktor Postol. This, look, for Diaz, you know, he was my prospect of the year last year. He made his HBO debut in March in a good quality fight for him in his debut. Interesting opponent for him in this fight. I mean, this is the definition of a stay busy fight. This Viktor Postol, this is his second fight since, or no, he's fought twice since 2008. And I think once since 2010. So this guy, you know, he had dozens of fights for a few years and then just stopped fighting. And he's had a couple of fights, like this will be, I think, his third fight in a decade or something. It's interesting how they find this guy, you know? But look, for Diaz, he's staying busy, getting more exposure on TV. This is set up for him to look really, really good and score a knockout. So he should go out there and look for him to score an impressive knockout in this fight. Obviously, though, the big card this weekend, got to talk about this one, man. In Barclays in Brooklyn, we've got Leo Santa Cruz going up against Carl Frampton for the WBA featherweight title. Frampton's moving up in weight to challenge Santa Cruz for the title he won recently. Interesting matchup, and I talked about this in an episode of 10 Count for UCN Live. Santa Cruz is a volume puncher. He's tall, rangy, long arms. And Frampton, in his American debut last year, fought a fighter like that, much less quality than Santa Cruz, and was dropped, I think, twice in the first round, faced a lot of adversity. May have been nerves. He may have just got caught. He came back to dominate the fight. But, man, that was his American debut. This is his return to the States. It's going to be interesting to see how he handles this. I say all that, and then I have to add that Frampton, I think, is the better athlete. And Frampton has better footwork, faster feet, good movement with his feet. He needs to come out early and box. He needs to try to make it a boring fight. He doesn't need to brawl with Santa Cruz. If he can make this a boring, dull, tactical fight, he's got a chance. But the more and more and more I think about this fight, you know, look, I've favored Santa Cruz all along, but I originally thought this would be a close competitive fight. I'm starting to lean to Santa Cruz by domination. I still think it'll go all 12, but man, I think Santa Cruz might get him out of there late, around the 10th round or so. TKO 10 for Santa Cruz. Also on this card, Mikey Garcia is making his return against a Dominican fighter, Eleider Alvarez. This is the first fight for Garcia since January of 2014. It's been 2.5 years, right? And this has nothing to do with injuries or legal problems. He just wanted more money. He wanted more money and more control of his career. I get it. But 2.5 years, I just don't give a shit. I'll start giving a shit if Garcia fights 2-3 more times over the next 8 to 9 months and gets busy, cuts down in weight, and starts fighting better opponents. Until then, I could give a shit, right? I'm critical of Andre Ward for this kind of crap. Yo, Garcia makes Andre Ward look active. So if I'm going to diss Andre Ward and get in his shit, I got to be consistent. So Mikey Garcia, I don't care. I'm not going to watch that fight. Paulie Malignaggi also fights on the undercard, and guess what? I could give a big flying fuck. I used to be a huge fan of Paulie, big supporter of him. I used to see him out here at functions when he lived in Los Angeles for a while, and just he was really, really cool. In the last few years, man, he's kind of become a hypocrite and some of his stances on things and everything. Still one of the best analysts in the business. You know, can't take that away from him. At his best, he was a good quality contender at 140, 147 pounds. But man, at this point, he's just become a hypocrite. So I just don't care to see that fight either. But that's all of it, guys. We'll talk next week about these fights. We'll review all that stuff. And then we kind of hit this lull in August with the Olympics coming up and everything else. But so maybe we'll have a week or two off in August. But then, you know, things will really get back into high gear in September. So I'll see you guys next week. As always, like, share, subscribe. See you next time.